Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me in this webinar on generative AI and confidential data. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. And if you have questions as you go along, feel free to pop them into the Q&A, and I'll address them when I can. So my name is Dmitri Evseev. I'm the founder of ARBI.CITY, which is an online platform for international disputes professionals with a mission to use technology to make dispute resolution practice more efficient, secure, inclusive, and enjoyable. We are working on some cutting-edge AI solutions and tools that we hope to release to the community in the coming weeks. And I encourage you to join the platform and subscribe to our LinkedIn newsletter to stay up to date. I myself have a background that includes both law and technology. I started working in tech in the 1990s. I co-founded my first tech company in college and then worked in IT in law firms and as a systems administrator at Harvard while studying law. And I spent the next 20 years as a disputes lawyer with major firms in Washington and London, and currently practice as an independent arbitrator with Arbitra International. I'm a member of the drafting committee for the Silicon Valley Arbitration Mediation Center, AI Task Force, which is working on guidelines for the use of AI in international arbitration. So that's my background. And why are we here talking about generative AI and confidential data? I'm assuming most of you who are tuning in are lawyers. And of course, lawyers work with confidential data every day. And we owe duties of confidentiality to our clients. We may handle various kinds of sensitive information. And we may be involved in proceedings like arbitrations that have their own confidentiality regimes. These days, almost all information is digital. And so being a lawyer inevitably involves considering whether a technology is safe to use for this or that work-related purpose. And if you're at a firm, you have IT departments that deal with cybersecurity and general policies like that. But it's still important for individual lawyers to have a general understanding of the concerns involved in using particular technologies. AI technologies have actually been around us for many years. AI tools already might help with various things that you use every day. So autocorrect on your phone or grammar checking in your word processor. AI algorithms are also used in machine translation, predictive coding for discovery, and even to determine which emails go in your spam, for instance. But until very recently, the AI technology was this invisible kind of automation for particular tasks that was in the background of whatever software application you are using. And now we are quickly moving into a new reality where AI tools are much more capable. They're much easier to interact with directly because it looks like they speak our language. And every company, big and small, is building AI tools. You have to live under a rock not to know about ChatGPT, for example. Before I get into the technology, I just want to do a quick poll of those who are here just to see how many of you think lawyers are already using ChatGPT or similar products. And while the poll is up, I want to mention that there is an increasing number of tools specifically aimed at lawyers. Thomson Reuters have a plugin for ChatGPT to help with legal research. LexisNexis is testing out generative AI. Jus Mundi recently introduced a summarizer for legal decisions. Law firms, beginning with Allen and Overy, are using a tool called Harvey. Denton's just announced a customized solution called Fleet AI. There's a tool called CoCounsel by Casetext, which is quite interesting. Microsoft is going to have a generative AI as a sidebar in the next version of Word, which isn't aimed at lawyers specifically, but when you think about the amount of time lawyers spend using Microsoft Word, I think it's also probably relevant to mention. Most of you responded to the poll saying either yes, for sure, lawyers are using ChatGPT or generative AI tools, or maybe hard to know. I think about an equal split there, but nobody picked the third option, which is no, I doubt that lawyers are using it. And of course, as lawyers, we doubt everything, but this is one thing that I think you can assume is probably true. Probably lawyers are using it. Certainly not everybody, maybe not most, but a number certainly are already using it. And we've seen some drastic examples. Everybody knows the case in New York where a lawyer was using ChatGPT to make up cases they didn't know they were made up. And when asked about whether the case citations were true, ChatGPT said, oh, absolutely, they're true. And the lawyer then relied on that to make a submission to the court. Of course, people love to mention this case, but the issues go much deeper about hallucinations, about reliability, about all sorts of other things. And we are here to focus on confidentiality specifically, but probably in future webinars, we'll cover things like hallucinations, reliability, and other things. Now, before we can get into the confidentiality issues, I need to explain at a high level how all this technology actually works. AI is not magic. It's just really clever computer science. And most of the solutions share some essential elements and features. So I'm going to bring up my presentation. Let me know if you have trouble seeing it. But in essence, this is the chart which you may have seen, which was in the starting image for the webinar that you registered for. But I'm going to go through it in great detail because I think this can actually anchor virtually everything that we're going to talk about today, basically as a roadmap to the variety of AI issues that you might encounter. First, you have a prompt. Essentially, a user submits something to the AI, which is either a question or a conversation, like with a chatbot. It could be also just a button that you click in an application to generate a summary or to generate a translation or transcription, something like that. So it may look different in every case, but in every case, this is your app or your user interface. Now, the important thing here is not to confuse the interface with the AI itself. So the AI is a model. It is something called a deep neural network. It's a computer program that is designed to mimic in some way the human brain. It has these connectors called neurons, and there are different layers of the network that process your input and then generate an output at the end. Now, it sounds fairly simple. The prompt goes in and an output goes out. And in a way, it is. It is simple because it's really just a really complicated way of processing something to get an output at the other end. That's a lot of very complicated math, a lot of clever programming, but that's ultimately all it is. A model is essentially something that takes an input from a user and then transforms it through all the different layers of the neural network and then spits out a response. And in the case of ChatGPT, for example, it's the answer to a question or a request. But this is true of all generative AI models. Essentially, what they do is they accept input in natural language, or in some generative AI, it might be an image or something else. But if we're talking about text models or large language models, it's usually text. And they spit out typically text on the other end as well, if it's a large language model. And it will also spit out text that looks like human speech. And you might be confused, you might be fooled into thinking this machine really thinks, or it fools a lot of people in thinking that it's human and it has some sort of superhuman abilities. But in reality, it is an algorithm, a very complicated algorithm, and indeed an algorithm that wasn't specifically programmed by a person. Rather, the machine learns these algorithms based on massive amounts of data that it ingests. So it's not necessarily an algorithm in the traditional sense of being a rule-based kind of decision tree. When you might think of an algorithm, you might think of if-then sequence. In this case, what you have is a model that is probabilistic. So it has different weights for different parameters. And then it does all these very complicated calculations to determine what is the most appropriate response to a given prompt. It will consider what it's been given, so the input, the prompt, and it will consider its knowledge about patterns, and the patterns that it has learned include language patterns, patterns of speech, and essentially concepts of meaning that it has also learned. The system will, for example, understand common misspellings. You can type something into ChatGPT and make a bunch of spelling mistakes, and it's still going to get what you're saying, just like a human would understand what you're saying. Because the machine is probabilistic, it says, okay, you might have spelled it this way. That's not the correct spelling, but it's close enough, and I get what you're saying. And that is one of those very human-like traits that makes us think that these machines are human and makes us feel like we're almost interacting with a human on the other side. And that, of course, comes into play when it comes to information that we are willing to give out or to share, because we have different instincts about interacting with other humans and interacting with machines. And these instincts get a little bit confused when you're dealing with something called ChatGPT, which almost feels like you're talking with a human. But it's not magic, it's not a human, it's a model that processes your response. And the really important distinction here between the app and the model exists because you can have an AI model, for example, in the case of ChatGPT, there's a model called GPT, which is powering it. A ChatGPT is just the interface. And today it can be powered by GPT 3.5. Tomorrow it'll be powered by GPT. And in this case, both ChatGPT and GPT are owned by the same company. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and increasingly is not the case. In fact, anyone can build an app that interacts with the GPT model. They can design it however they want to. It can be their own app, but as long as it sends requests to the same model, you will get the same responses back, and it will appear essentially like you're interacting through ChatGPT. The same goes for other models. There are a number of other models beyond GPT. Some are equally as good or better at certain tasks. There's a model called Claude by Anthropic, which is built into Slack. There are a number of other products. It can also be used in standalone applications. There is an open model called Llama or Llama 2 that Meta has put out, which in fact anyone can take and copy and put up on their own server. So even though you're using their model, you are running it on your own hardware or your own cloud. So essentially it's your own model for all intents and purposes, because it doesn't go to Meta or doesn't go to anyone else. So that is the essential distinction, because an AI app is just what you're looking at, your web page, and the same app can be powered by different models, and also the same models can power different apps. And I think it's very important to bear that in mind and not to confuse the app that you're using with the underlying model. So today we have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of different apps, all of them powered by GPT, for example. Some of them are powered by other models that other companies have created, or maybe even privately developed models. If you're a large company like Bloomberg, you can afford to build your own large language model that is yours, that is not based on something that someone else created. And models sometimes are described in terms of the number of parameters they have or how complex they are, or how much training data they have been trained on, or their different architectures. So there are various distinctions, but basically the bigger and more complex the model and the more information it's been trained on, the better it's going to be at the tasks for which it was trained on, or in the case of ChatGPT and other very large language models, they can even perform tasks on which they were not specifically trained. So you can just give it a new task and it will do it even though it wasn't very specifically trained for that particular task, which is quite amazing. And obviously one of the reasons why these language models are so popular. Going back to confidential data, if you look at the prompt that a user submits, so you can say something like, give me a recipe for guacamole, and ChatGPT is going to answer. And of course, that doesn't have any confidential information in it, and you don't need to worry about it. But if you are looking to use it for work-related purposes, then of course you might inadvertently or on purpose put in something into an AI prompt that does have confidential information in it or might reveal confidential information. And you need to understand what happens to that information and where it's stored, where it goes, who has access to it, and for what purposes. So that is really a big part of what I want to cover today. Now, another way that confidential information can get into the AI model or can get out essentially is if you have built other tools or other plugins, so let's call them, that help you generate a better response from the AI model. And one very common practice these days is to give the model additional context or additional information before it answers your question. For example, you might ask a question like, who is the current president of the United States? And because ChatGPT was trained on data that goes up to 2021, it probably will say Joe Biden, but it won't know who the prime minister of the UK is because we've had so many. So it might not be able to give you an answer, but if you give it additional context in your prompt, and this can be automated by either accessing the internet or accessing a certain set of documents that is fed in to the model at the same time along with your question, that increases your chances of getting an accurate response and a relevant response. And in fact, as we'll probably have to do another webinar to focus on this, can actually give you a way to cite or to give sources to the response that you get. But in essence, what this plugin function allows companies to do is to give additional relevant information. And one way to think about this interaction with the AI model is, without humanizing it too much, think of it as essentially a genius that's locked in a room with no access to the outside world. And the only way you can communicate with that genius is through a little hole under the door. And you can just put in a piece of paper with your question, and the genius will write an answer to that question and pass it back to you. Now, if you just pass the question, you're only going to get an answer that has to be based on what the genius already knows and your question. Now, if you also pass a few documents together with your question, then you can ask a question specifically about your data or about your documents, which makes it far more useful. And that is exactly what enterprises these days, including law firms, are really focused on. How do you make these AI models be able to answer questions about your data, about your cases, about your information? Obviously, this is another way that confidential and highly confidential information can get passed. The model then will generate a response back to the user. what is really important to understand about this step is that the model doesn't remember anything by itself. So every time something is sent to the AI model, it basically starts afresh based on the data on which it was trained, and the training might have been completed a year or two ago, depending on the model that you're using. So between the time it was trained or last retrained, the model doesn't learn, and it doesn't store your data. It doesn't store your information by itself. In fact, the way these applications are designed is there is a log of, let's say, your conversation history, and then every time you ask a follow-up question, it passes all of your previous questions along with that last question in order to make sure that the model remembers, or to give it a little bit of memory about the conversation that happened before. So this is another really key thing to understand. The model doesn't retain data or learn on the fly. So you might think, oh, you might have heard about a lot of things. Oh, these models will retain or learn all this data. The important thing to know is that doesn't happen automatically or necessarily, but in fact, companies that operate these models, or companies that have these apps, they will typically log the inputs and responses. So they will save somewhere a log of all the communication thread, with or without attribution as to the user that submitted those questions. But often this is to monitor for abuse. So oftentimes some information is retained in these logs about who submitted the query, about what the response was. And you can imagine the implications of these logs for something like document discovery, right? If you're in the US, you probably have more chance of getting that kind of discovery than you might in an international arbitration or in other countries. But the fact that these logs exist and that they are often maintained by the AI service provider is an issue that needs to be considered, and I would say is probably the central issue where confidentiality is concerned. So a lot of people are focused, I think, unduly the notion that the model just learns or retains information. And from a technical perspective, that's not correct. That doesn't happen automatically. What does happen is these logs are created. Now, sometimes these logs are by the company itself or by the law firm, in which case they might be protected, but then the law firm has access to the logs, and then the individual user, let's say a lawyer working at a firm, would have all of their queries logged and stored, again, maybe for abuse monitoring purposes, maybe for audit purposes of some sort, regulatory compliance, etc. And sometimes also the chat interface gives the user the opportunity to download their conversation history. ChatGPT has that function. You can go and you can look at your previous conversation threads, you can download them, so they're available to you as the user. That, of course, is one of the first things to check, and one of the first things to understand when you're reading through the terms of use or the privacy policy or the contract that you might have with an AI service provider. What happens to these logs? What is stored, and what can these logs be used for? Now, a lot of law firms are banning ChatGPT use at work. I think that's right. I think you shouldn't be using a public tool like ChatGPT for work purposes where there's a chance of confidential information leaking. And the reason is because ChatGPT has a very liberal policy, or at least used to have a very liberal policy in terms of allowing themselves to retain all of the data indefinitely and using it for a variety of purposes, including potentially sharing with third parties or retraining their model with it in the future. They've recently taken some steps to make it a bit more restrictive. But in general, if you're using a consumer product like ChatGPT, I think you want to be really careful. Now, there are a number of solutions that are coming on the market which are more privacy focused, There is something called Azure OpenAI from Microsoft, and this is, I think, at the base of the solution that Denton's has recently implemented, if I understand it correctly. And that is a version of the GPT model, which is run by Microsoft. So nothing goes to OpenAI, and Microsoft retains it only for retains chat history only for 30 days for abuse monitoring purposes, and then deletes it. OpenAI now also has a similar policy, and if you're building an app on top of the underlying model, it also by default, GPT will not store anything for longer than 30 days and will only use it for abuse monitoring purposes. So that might be sufficient, and in fact, Microsoft has Azure OpenAI servers in Europe and other countries. So if you have data residency requirements, or you have your data already in the Azure cloud, that might be a good solution for you to use essentially the same tool, the same GPT engine. And it's not difficult to do. I've done it myself. You can quite easily set up, if you know how to code a little bit even, it's quite easy to set that up. And I think most IT departments would be up to the task of setting up something far more private with very similar functionality to ChatGPT. And then, of course, large companies will have their own solutions built on top of it. Now, moving on to the next step, what might also happen is these logs and also potentially company data is going to be used to fine-tune the next version of the model. So as I said, the model doesn't learn anything on the fly, but you can collect all of this information and you can submit it to the model in order for it to learn essentially new information and adjust its parameters to take account of new data, to take account of human feedback. Sometimes you have the explicit purpose of these logs is to collect human feedback, and you can do up or down votes saying, hey, this response was good, no, this response was not good, or even here's a better response. And the model then adjusts it can be adjusted to take account of this feedback, and then the new version of the model will be smarter and more suitable to the task that you want to use it for. Of course, there is a host of issues that come up if you take advantage of this option, or if your AI service provider reserves the right to use this data for either the logs or other data that it has to retrain the model. Again, I would say that these issues are often not as significant as you might think, because the model won't itself have your logs or your confidential information. Virtually impossible, if not completely impossible, to extract any specific confidential information out of a model, particularly out of a large language model, which is trained on trillions of data points. And at bottom, it's just a bunch of numbers. Backing out or extracting confidential data out of the model is very difficult, if not completely impossible. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't worry about it. You should worry about it. And this fine-tuning and a retraining step is something that undoubtedly requires quite serious technical abilities and understandings, and something that if a company is willing to undertake it, either by themselves or in collaboration with an AI service provider, that is something that they will need to consider. They'll need to consider, we want a fine-tuned model. We want a model that knows our data, but then are we risking in some way that this model, now that it knows this data, will it reveal it, or will others be able to extract it somehow? And then, of course, how is this data stored? How is the training data stored? These are all very complicated questions, but I would say I don't want to spend too much time on it, because it's not something that most of you as users of these systems will need to worry about. I would just say that the one thing to bear in mind is just in the terms of use of these models, just try to make sure that either the AI service providers not retaining these rights to train the model with your input, or ensure that you are holding on to it in-house if you're part of an organization that is deploying your own fine-tuned model. I mentioned at the outset that I'm going to answer questions, but in terms of the key takeaways that I want you to take out of this presentation is there are several ways in which confidential data could be exposed. There's the input prompt. There is the context, additional context, which might be submitted along with the prompt in order to get a better result from the model. There are the logs, which again, I would say are the critical thing to worry about and to be concerned about. And then the fourth is the potential for confidential data coming out in retraining and the new model that is there after retraining. In terms of the different solutions that can be adopted, there are, of course, contractual arrangements. And when you just use ChatGPT, you just have the terms of use on their website. And that's why it's a public tool and not really suitable for professional use with confidential data. But if you have an AI service provider that you've contracted with, or you are using the business version of GPT, you will have some kind of contractual arrangements, and that might be sufficient for you because, of course, lawyers do trust online platforms like case management platforms with confidential data, and copy vendors or any translators or all sorts of online services where you submit your confidential documents, and what you have there is some contractual commitment by the vendor to respect your confidentiality, to not store your data, adopt various procedures to ensure that the security of your information is maintained. I'm not getting into cybersecurity issues in this presentation. That would be a whole nother set of issues, but more relevant for IT personnel, of course. So the other type of solution is to really bring these models on-premise or in-house and essentially ensure that these models are actually hosted by you or by your firm on your servers, and whether those servers are sitting in your offices or they're in a private data center or private cloud environment, which there are also these big cloud service providers allow companies to have their own private cloud. Nobody can get into it. Everything is encrypted. That is another very reasonable type of solution that can be adopted, and I think is increasingly adopted by enterprises. Another solution that I haven't really talked about, but is important to mention, optimization. That might be something people do just ad hoc. Let's say you want to have an answer to a question, but you don't want to write the question in a way that reveals confidential data. So you think of a way to write the question without revealing confidential data, but still get a useful answer. So that is one way to do it just manually. But there are also automated tools for anonymization, for getting rid of personally identifiable information, which essentially process your information or query before it goes out to the AI tool. And then essentially you don't send anything confidential out. That's the idea. Then there are other approaches using cryptography and various complicated encryption techniques, which again, I'm not going to get into, but there are several very interesting solutions that are developed in the medical sector, for example, where you've got a lot of patient data and you want to be able to study the statistics or patterns in the data without revealing any personal information. And there are different tools that are being developed in that space. And I'm sure in the legal space, there will also be similar tools developed to allow AI operations or data insights without revealing personally identifiable or confidential privileged information. And then there are also even cryptography tools that are now being built into the hardware so that no human ever sees anything that's unencrypted. That is, in a way, the ideal. So you don't actually have to trust any person or any company as long as essentially it's the AI alone with your data and no person ever sees it. And that may resolve another set of concerns. But again, I don't want to dwell on it. And I think the most important bottom line that I want to mention is you should just always ensure that the solution that you are looking to use or your company is using is vetted and approved from the standpoint of confidential information and how it's stored and how it is being used. I think it's quite basic, but I do think that people sometimes get lazy and carried away and don't think about these issues, or they might have just misconceptions about how the technology works or what's behind it, either assuming that just everything is stored and everything is going to be public, or anyway, I hope this was useful. I'm going to take the presentation off the screen, but I want to leave time for questions. I'll give just a few minutes time for everyone who is on to think of some questions. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom. You can click on that. And while I'm asking this, I also wanted to do another poll and see what we should try to do as a topic for the next episode. And some of the options would be reliability, reducing hallucinations and increasing reliance on verifiable sources. Privacy, private AI that can be customized for you and your particular practice. Explainable AI, which is about understanding exactly how AI produces its results and how it gets to the outcome, how the algorithms work, and that sort of thing. And then last but not least, inclusive AI and the question of how different biases and the training data and elsewhere impact the outcomes, impact the reliability also of the outcomes, and how we can promote and making sure also that everyone really benefits from these technologies, because I think one of the real issues here is many people don't feel ready for this and don't feel well equipped to transition to a mode of work which incorporates generative AI, or people are worried about their jobs being taken by generative AI. I think everyone has probably voted who was going to vote. Half of you wanted to hear about reliable AI, another third, most wanted to hear about the private AI, and then about equal split of the remainder for explainable AI and inclusive AI. Thank you. That really helps to think about what the next webinar topic is going to be. So I'm going to read a question that came in through the Q&A, and I'm going to try to respond as best I can. So the comment is, currently legal professionals are discussing the new Zoom terms of use, which contain a consent of paid and unpaid users given to Zoom for the use, processing, transferring of any information processed through Zoom. As we are talking about AI and confidential data over Zoom today, could you share your opinion regarding the provision and the use of Zoom by lawyers and the duty of confidentiality? And that could be a topic for a future webinar. Yes, so very good point. I have also seen that Zoom has recently updated their terms of use, and I have heard other people saying, okay, we're switching to Microsoft Teams, or we're switching to Google Chat from now on because we don't like the fact that Zoom is doing this. I don't know if these terms are applicable to everyone who uses Zoom, because they're obviously professional level, enterprise level subscriptions, and I suspect that those who have these enterprise level subscriptions probably could either are not subject to these rules. I'm sure Zoom, they're not going to want to lose big customers who depend on Zoom remaining confidential. I think this will be a big issue, and I'm confident that it will be resolved in some way that does allow people to continue using Zoom for confidential conversations. But it is important to pay attention to it, and it is important. And it also is an important trend because a lot of companies are now saying we may want to use the data that we're accumulating for customizing our services, for improving our products. And as people start using these language models more and more, it will be a big issue, will be a big legal issue in terms of who really owns that data, right? Is it your data or is it the company's data? And if you're in the EU or UK or other countries with pretty strong data privacy protections, then typically the rules will allow you significant leverage in terms of what happens with your data and in terms of being able to know what happens to it, how it can be used, and restricts these kind of blanket decisions by a service provider to use your data for some other new purpose. So I do think there are protections out there for most people. I do think that this issue is going to be significant, but thank you for the question. Are there any more questions? We're running at the hour mark. We should probably close shortly. All right. Thank you very much for everyone who has joined. I'm delighted that we've had a good audience, and this video is going to be available on ARBI.CITY for anyone to view and download, or if you want to share it with someone who wasn't able to make it today, by all means, feel free. You will get an email with a link to see the final video, and you'll be able to share that with other people, although you might have to register on ARBI.CITY for a free account. Thank you very much, and hope you have a good day.